My name is Eliza Hayes, and I was just 17 years old, standing on the precipice of everything I had ever worked for. My entire life had been a meticulously planned ascent, each step carefully calculated, each grade a rung on a ladder leading to a future I could only dream of. That future, I believed, hinged on one thing: graduating as valedictorian. But then Mrs. Johnson, my calculus teacher, stepped in and tried to snatch it all away, not just with a failing grade, but with a casual cruelty that still makes my stomach clench. "Some students just aren't cut out for success," she announced, her words like a practiced, dismissive sigh. Little did she know, those words would become the fuel for a fire she could never extinguish. If you've ever felt like the world was actively working against you, or like someone in a position of power was using their influence to crush your dreams, then you know a sliver of what I felt. It's a gut punch, a betrayal, and it leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about fairness. So, if this resonates with you, or if you've faced down your own Goliath, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of overcoming, and tell me where you're listening from in the comments below. Your stories keep us all going. Life before that fateful grade was, by all accounts, structured and demanding, but utterly fulfilling. I lived in a modest two-story house in Willow Creek, a town that proudly boasted about its academic achievements, mostly thanks to students like me. Our house, with its slightly peeling paint and perpetually overgrown rose bushes, was a haven of quiet determination. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, a place where my mom, Sarah, worked tirelessly to ensure I had every opportunity she could afford. Most mornings, I'd wake before dawn, the aroma of her strong coffee already brewing, a testament to her equally early start. I'd typically roll out of bed around 5:30 a.m., padding barefoot to the small, cramped bathroom to get ready, listening to the gentle hum of our old refrigerator. After a quick shower, I'd make my way downstairs for a bowl of instant oatmeal, usually joined by my mom, who would be reviewing her lesson plans for the day. She was an elementary school teacher, and her dedication to her students was something I had always admired and tried to emulate. We'd talk about our day ahead, about my studies, her students, and sometimes, just about the weather, our voices hushed so as not to wake my younger brother, Leo, who was still deep in his teenage slumber. My part-time job was at the Willow Creek Public Library, a beautiful old building with soaring ceilings and the comforting scent of aged paper and lemon polish. I loved that job. It was quiet, methodical, and surrounded me with stories, which, ironically, mirrored my own developing narrative. My daily tasks involved shelving returned books, checking out new ones, and occasionally helping patrons navigate the labyrinthine Dewey Decimal System. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, was a stern but kind woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of literature and an uncanny ability to know exactly what book someone needed, even before they did. I worked 3 afternoons a week, from 3:30 to 6:30 p.m., right after school. My favorite part was the story time for toddlers on Thursdays, where I'd get to read aloud, often adopting different voices for each character. It was a stark contrast to the high-stakes academic world, a gentle reminder that there was beauty in simplicity. It also provided a crucial income, helping my mom with groceries and contributing to my own burgeoning college fund, a fund that, even with my contributions, was always on the verge of empty. We weren't poor, but every dollar counted, and the idea of a scholarship was less a dream and more a strategic necessity. Academically, I was a force. My GPA was a near-perfect 3.98, only marred by an A in sophomore English, poetic injustice, I felt at the time. My afternoons were a blur of school, library, and then home to my study nook, a small desk tucked into the corner of my bedroom, illuminated by a single, slightly wobbly lamp. I'd spend hours there, poring over textbooks, writing essays, and solving complex calculus problems, often late into the night. Sleep was a luxury I indulged in sparingly. My social life was minimal, consisting mostly of my best friend, Chloe, who understood my drive and was often found alongside me in the library, though usually with a pop fiction novel rather than a calculus textbook. Chloe was a breath of fresh air, always reminding me to take a break, to breathe, to simply be 17. We grab ice cream on Fridays after my library shift, or occasionally catch a movie, but even those outings were carefully scheduled around my academic commitments. Romantic relationships, non-existent. My focus was a laser beam pointed squarely at my future. I saw a life beyond Willow Creek, a life of intellectual pursuit and meaningful work, and that vision demanded every ounce of my effort. My family, as I mentioned, was just my mother, Sarah, and my younger brother, Leo. My father had left when I was 7, a hazy memory of hushed arguments and the scent of his Old Spice cologne fatting from the house. It had been hard, but my mother, a woman of steel wrapped in a soft exterior, had built a new life for us, brick by determined brick. She was in her early 40s, with kind, tired eyes that held a lifetime of quiet strength. Her sandy blonde hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, was starting to show streaks of silver, each one, I felt, a testament to her resilience. Leo, at 14, was the quintessential younger brother, messy, prone to sarcastic remarks, but fiercely loyal. He had a mop of dark brown hair that always fell into his eyes and a grin that could charm anyone. We lived as a tight-knit unit, a small, independent constellation in the vastness of Willow Creek. Our family dynamics were simple. My mom was the undisputed matriarch, the provider, the guiding star. I was the responsible eldest, her right hand, often helping with household chores, tutoring Leo in math much to his theatrical displeasure, and acting as a sounding board for her daily frustrations. Leo, for his part, was the mischievous younger sibling who, despite his antics, always looked up to me. Our traditions were built around presence and support. Sunday dinners were mandatory, even if it was just takeout pizza devoured around our chipped kitchen table. We'd talk about our week, celebrate small victories, a good grade for Leo, a successful presentation for Mom, or a particularly challenging book I'd finally mastered. Communication was open, almost brutally so. My mother believed in facing problems head-on, a trait she had certainly instilled in me. When decisions needed to be made, whether it was about a new appliance or my college applications, it was a family discussion, with everyone's input valued. There was a strong sense of us against the world, a bond forged in shared challenges and unwavering support. Then there was the Johnson family. Mrs. Johnson, my calculus teacher, was an imposing figure, not just physically but professionally. In her late 50s, with a perfectly coiffed silver bob and sharp, intelligent eyes, she commanded respect and often fear. She was known for her rigorous curriculum and for churning out students who excelled in STEM fields. Her reputation was impeccable, a pillar of the school's academic success. Her daughter, Tiffany, was my classmate and my direct rival for the valedictorian title. Tiffany was a year-round athlete, a talented debater, and by all accounts, an exceptionally bright student. She had her mother's sharp eyes, but softened by a perpetual, slightly smug smile. Tiffany seemed to glide through school, effortlessly achieving, always surrounded by a clique of equally polished, high-achieving friends. The hierarchy was clear. Mrs. Johnson was a respected authority, and Tiffany was her golden child, destined for greatness, groomed for it. I always felt a subtle undercurrent of tension in Mrs. Johnson's presence, especially when Tiffany was nearby. It wasn't overt, but it was there, like static electricity in the air. I remembered one specific parent-teacher conference in middle school when Mrs. Johnson had praised Tiffany's innate mathematical genius in front of my mother, then followed it with a backhanded compliment about my diligent, if less intuitive, approach. My mother had just smiled politely, but I felt the sting of comparison. Holiday preparations in our home were a flurry of baking and planning simple gifts, while I imagined the Johnsons having elegant, curated gatherings, where academic achievements were likely the main topic of conversation. Family meetings for us were about budget and responsibilities. For them, I suspected, they were about strategic university choices and networking opportunities. I watched Tiffany's life unfold, seemingly without effort, and constantly felt the unspoken pressure to work twice as hard just to stand on the same ground. The pattern of perceived favoritism wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow, insidious burn that had started years ago. I remember vividly, at Tiffany's 10th birthday party, which, naturally, Mrs. Johnson hosted. Tiffany received a brand-new, top-of-the-line bicycle, gleaming red and silver, complete with all the bells and whistles. I and the other kids were given small party favors, a bag of candy and a sticker book. When my own 10th birthday came 2 months later, my mom, struggling financially, managed to get me a gently used bike from a garage sale, which I adored. But the stark contrast stuck with me. It wasn't just the gifts. It was the way Mrs. Johnson looked at Tiffany, a proud, almost proprietary gleam in her eyes that I rarely saw directed at anyone else, especially not at me. Another memory from our 8th grade science fair. Tiffany's project on crystal growth was a marvel of iridescent formations, displayed on a custom-built, backlit stand. Mrs. Johnson, who was one of the judges, spent an inordinate amount of time at Tiffany's booth, asking leading questions that seemed to guide her daughter to even more insightful answers, praising her innate scientific curiosity. My project, a comparatively humble but meticulously researched demonstration of plant photosynthesis, received a polite nod and a brief, almost perfunctory, question about my methodology. I still got an A, but the feeling that my effort was somehow less valid, less celebrated, lingered. I was always good enough, but never exceptional in Mrs. Johnson's eyes, not like Tiffany. In 9th grade, during an after-school tutoring session for Algebra I, which Mrs. Johnson oversaw, I distinctly recall her spending a solid 20 minutes explaining a complex problem only to Tiffany, while the rest of us sat quietly, occasionally exchanging glances. When I tentatively raised my hand to ask for clarification on a different problem, Mrs. Johnson waved me off with a curt, "That's standard material. Eliza, you should review your notes," before turning back to Tiffany with a warm smile. "Now about that quadratic formula extension." It wasn't just about the subject matter. It was the warmth, the patience, the extra attention that Tiffany always seemed to receive, while I got the standard, by-the-book treatment, sometimes less. Then there was the scholarship opportunity for a summer STEM camp at a prestigious university. It was highly competitive, and both Tiffany and I applied. Mrs. Johnson wrote the recommendation letters. Tiffany got the scholarship. I didn't. I never saw the recommendation letters, of course, but a part of me, even then, wondered if Mrs. Johnson's letter for me had been as glowing as the one she undoubtedly penned for her daughter. It was another instance, among many, where Tiffany effortlessly sailed through doors that felt like they had to be pried open for me with immense effort. These moments, these subtle cues, solidified a pattern. I learned early on that to succeed, I couldn't just be good. I had to be undeniably, irrefutably better than Tiffany, and even then it might not be enough. It fostered in me a fierce, almost obsessive drive. I poured myself into my studies, not just to learn, but to prove. To prove to Mrs. Johnson, to the world, and most importantly to myself, that my hard work and dedication were enough, even if I wasn't her favored student. My self-esteem became intrinsically tied to my academic achievements, a fragile tower built on the shifting sands of external validation. I learned to cope by simply outworking everyone, by ensuring my results were so undeniable that no one, not even Mrs. Johnson, could dispute them. It worked, until it didn't. The final semester of senior year was a pressure cooker, the air thick with college acceptance letters, scholarship deadlines, and the looming shadow of graduation. The valedictorian race between Tiffany and me was neck and neck, a mere fraction of a GPA point separating us. Every single assignment, every quiz, every final exam felt like it carried the weight of my entire future. My anxiety was a constant hum beneath my skin, an unwelcome companion that intensified every time I walked into Mrs. Johnson's calculus class. She had become different. The subtle favoritism towards Tiffany, which had always been present, sharpened into a dismissive, almost hostile edge towards me. Her criticisms of my work grew vaguer, yet more scathing. "Eliza, this is acceptable, but it lacks insight," she'd say, handing back a perfect paper with a B etched in red ink, an unheard-of grade for me in her class. Then she'd turn to Tiffany, whose work might have a minor error, and gush, "Tiffany, darling, your ingenuity in approaching this problem is simply breathtaking." I would meticulously review my returned assignments, comparing them against the textbook, against solutions I'd found online, even against Chloe's notes, and I couldn't find a single error to justify the sudden dip in my grades. It felt like I was being graded on a curve that only applied to me, and it was bending downwards. One afternoon, about a month before the final exam, I approached her after class, my calculus textbook clutched to my chest. "Mrs. Johnson," I began, my voice carefully modulated to sound respectful. I was hoping you could clarify a few points on my last test. I'm struggling to understand where I went wrong, particularly with problem 3, which I believe I solved correctly according to the method we discussed. She didn't even look up from her desk, where she was meticulously organizing a stack of papers, Tiffany's papers, I noticed, prominently on top. "Eliza," she said, her tone as dry as old parchment, "the answer is incorrect. The method, while technically applied, missed the deeper conceptual understanding required. It's a fundamental error." "But, Mrs. Johnson, the numerical answer is correct, and the steps I took are logically sound," I pressed, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Could you show me, specifically, where the conceptual error lies?" She finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Eliza, I don't have time to reteach the entire unit. Perhaps you need to spend more time reviewing the foundational principles. Some students just don't grasp the nuances as quickly as others." She dismissed me with a wave of her hand, turning back to Tiffany's stack of papers. The implication hung in the air. I was the other student, the slow one, the one who didn't grasp the nuances, unlike her daughter. I walked away, my stomach churning, a cold knot of dread beginning to form. I shared my concerns with Chloe that evening over our usual ice cream. "It's like she has it out for me, Chloe," I confided, stirring my mint chip aggressively. "Every single grade in her class is being scrutinized, and I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." Chloe, ever pragmatic, suggested I just focus on acing the final. "It's one grade, Eliza. You've always pulled through. Don't let her get to you." I tried to believe her, but the unease persisted, a growing suspicion that this wasn't just about a grade. It was about something far more personal. The day of the final calculus exam dawned gray and damp, mirroring the nervous flutter in my chest. I had spent weeks studying, reviewing every concept, every formula, every possible problem variation. I felt prepared, as ready as I could ever be. The exam itself was challenging, but I worked through it meticulously, double-checking every calculation, every step. When I walked out of the classroom, a cautious optimism bloomed in my chest. I had done it. I had aced it. The grades for the final exam and the overall course were posted online 3 days later. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. I was in my room, sitting at my study desk, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I clicked on the school's online portal. I navigated to my calculus class, my breath catching in my throat. The page loaded slowly, each pixel a torment, and then I saw it. Final exam grade, 58%, F. Overall course grade, C. The world tilted. The numbers swam before my eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. 58%. It was impossible. A sick, cold wave washed over me, a nauseating lurch that sent all the blood rushing from my face. My hands began to tremble, my phone almost slipping from my grasp. I reloaded the page, convinced it was a glitch, a mistake. But the numbers remained, stark and unforgiving. A 58% on an exam I knew, with every fiber of my being, I had aced. And with that, my overall course grade plummeted, effectively knocking me out of contention for valedictorian. Tiffany, I knew without checking, would now effortlessly claim the title. My future, my scholarships, my years of tireless work, felt like they were disintegrating before my very eyes. I stumbled out of my room, my legs feeling like jelly, and found my mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "Mom," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. She turned, her eyes immediately scanning my face, her expression shifting from casual to concerned in an instant. "Eliza, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I held out my phone, the screen still displaying the damning grades. "Mrs. Johnson, she failed me on the calculus final. It's impossible, Mom. I know I aced that test." Tears welled up, blurring my vision, hot and stinging. My mother took the phone, her brow furrowing as she read the grades. Her jaw tightened, a familiar line of fierce determination setting in. She knew, as I did, that this wasn't just a poor grade. This was an attack. The next morning, armed with a desperate, burgeoning fury, I went to school early, determined to confront Mrs. Johnson. The hallway outside her classroom was empty, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a sterile glow. Her door was ajar, and I pushed it open, my hand clammy on the cool metal. She was at her desk, marking papers, her silver hair perfectly in place. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Johnson," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. I saw my calculus grades online. The final exam, a 58%. I don't understand. I know I didn't get a 58%. She set her red pen down deliberately, her gaze fixed on me, cold and unwavering. Eliza, your performance on the final exam was subpar. Your answers lacked the depth and precision required. It was a clear indication that you haven't grasped the more advanced concepts. But I studied for weeks. I checked and rechecked everything. I know how to do those problems. My voice cracked, raw with emotion. I can't possibly have failed. This isn't fair. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a chilling curve that sent a shiver down my spine. Fairness, Eliza, is a subjective concept. Performance, however, is not. The grade stands. You simply did not meet the expectations. She paused, her eyes glinting. And frankly, some students just aren't cut out for success when the material demands a certain innate aptitude. Perhaps your talents lie elsewhere. The words hung in the air, a poisonous miasma. Some students just aren't cut out for success. Her voice was devoid of empathy, laced with a casual cruelty that felt like a physical blow. It was the echo of all those subtle slights, all those past comparisons, amplified into an undeniable truth. She wasn't just failing my exam, she was failing me. She was dismissing my worth, my potential, my years of relentless effort, all to clear the path for her daughter. My throat closed up, tears blurring my vision. My stomach clenched, a searing pain radiating through my core. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, hot and suffocating. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound, soul-deep betrayal. You did this on purpose, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. You did this for Tiffany. Her smile widened, a thin, humorless line. Eliza, I grade purely on merit. It would be unprofessional to suggest otherwise. But her eyes, cold and triumphant, told a different story. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that my entire future had just been sacrificed on the altar of Mrs. Johnson's maternal ambition. I turned and fled, the taste of ash and defeat filling my mouth. The hours immediately following that confrontation were a blur of raw, visceral pain. I don't remember much of the walk home, only the cold, biting wind on my face and the hot, steady stream of tears blurring the world around me. My chest ached, a hollow, empty sensation where my dreams had once resided. The image of Mrs. Johnson's cold, triumphant smile was burned into my mind, a chilling testament to her calculated cruelty. When I finally stumbled through our front door, my mother was waiting, her face etched with worry. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably, the dam finally breaking. She did it, Mom, I choked out, my voice thick with tears and snot. She failed me. She said I wasn't cut out for success. My mother held me tight, her embrace a lifeline in the storm of my grief. She didn't say anything, just held me, letting me release the torrent of pain and frustration that had been building for months. Later that evening, after the initial shock had worn off, a cold, hard anger began to set in. My mom, ever the pragmatic one, insisted we wouldn't just sit back and accept this. Eliza, you've worked too hard for this. We're fighting it. We spent hours meticulously going through my notes, my past assignments, comparing my answers to textbook solutions. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My exam answers were correct. The 58% was a manufactured grade, a deliberate act of sabotage. My mother tried calling the principal, Mr. Davies, but his secretary informed her he was unavailable, and that all grading matters are solely at the discretion of the teacher. It was a polite brush-off, but it felt like another door slamming shut in my face. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash. Sleep offered no escape, only restless tossing and turning, haunted by Mrs. Johnson's smug face. I felt physically ill, the betrayal manifesting as a constant knot in my stomach. Our first attempt at reconciliation, or rather rectification, came the very next day. My mother, dressed in her most formidable parent-teacher conference attire, accompanied me to Mrs. Johnson's classroom after school. The air was thick with tension. Mrs. Johnson sat behind her desk, flanked by stacks of papers, an impenetrable fortress. Mrs. Johnson, my mother began, her voice calm but firm, Eliza and I are here to discuss her final exam grade. We've reviewed her work, and we are convinced there has been a significant error." She placed my meticulously reworked solutions, along with photocopies of the relevant textbook pages, on Mrs. Johnson's desk. Mrs. Johnson barely glanced at them. "Ms. Hayes, as I explained to Eliza, the grade reflects her performance. There are no errors. My grading rubric is consistent, and I assure you, I am an experienced educator." She leaned back, her arms crossed, a picture of unshakable authority. "Perhaps Eliza's understanding of the foundational principles isn't as solid as she believes." "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson," my mother countered, her voice rising slightly, "Eliza has maintained an A average in your class all year. To suddenly drop to a 58% on a final exam after weeks of intense study is simply inexplicable without a clear explanation of where she supposedly went wrong. She can show you, point by point, how her answers align with the curriculum. I am not obligated to regrade an exam, especially not to students who are questioning my professional judgment," Mrs. Johnson stated, her voice hardening. "This discussion is unproductive. The grade stands." She then gestured towards the door, a clear dismissal. My mother, for once, was speechless, her face flushed with indignation. I just stood there, a silent witness to Mrs. Brick Wall. My hopes, already fragile, crumbled further. The second attempt involved Mr. Henderson, our school's guidance counselor. Mr. Henderson was a kind, affable man, a veteran educator who genuinely cared about the students. He listened patiently as my mother and I explained the situation, showing him my graded exam and my own solutions. He frowned, shaking his head. "Eliza, I'm so sorry this is happening. You're one of our brightest students." He agreed to mediate a meeting with Mrs. Johnson and the principal, hopeful that a neutral party could facilitate a resolution. The meeting took place 2 days later in the principal's office, a stuffy room filled with imposing dark wood furniture. Mr. Davies, the principal, was a jovial, usually approachable man, but today he looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting nervously between us and Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson sat ramrod straight, radiating an air of injured innocence. "Mrs. Johnson," Mr. Henderson began, "Eliza and her mother have presented compelling evidence that suggests a potential discrepancy in Eliza's final exam grade. We're hoping we can review the exam together and address her concerns." "There is nothing to review, Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Johnson interjected, her voice sharp. "My grading is beyond reproach. Furthermore," she turned to Mr. Davies, "I find it highly unprofessional for a student or her parent to continually challenge a teacher's academic authority, especially with such baseless accusations." Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "Mrs. Johnson has an excellent track record, Ms. Hayes. Her judgment is rarely, if ever, called into question." He smiled weakly at us. "While I understand your concern, Eliza, teachers are the ultimate arbiters of grades in their classrooms. I'm afraid my hands are tied." He might as well have been wearing handcuffs. He was clearly intimidated by Mrs. Johnson's reputation and unwilling to challenge her. The meeting ended with Mrs. Johnson triumphant, and us, once again, defeated. Each failed attempt chipped away at my spirit, leaving me feeling increasingly helpless and utterly alone. The injustice was a festering wound, growing more painful with every dismissal. I would try to function, going to my library job, attempting to study for other classes, but the feeling of utter hopelessness was a heavy shroud, muffling every joy, every ambition. My mom, however, was not one to give up easily. After the principal's dismissal, she announced, "This isn't over, Eliza, not by a long shot." She started talking to other parents, quietly, discreetly, about our situation. It turned out we weren't alone. One mother, Mrs. Chen, whose son had been denied a coveted position in the school's advanced robotics club, which Mrs. Johnson oversaw, for lack of creative problem-solving skills. A position that conveniently went to Tiffany's younger brother, told my mom. "It's always been like this. Mrs. Johnson's family always comes first." These hushed conversations, these whispers of similar injustices, ignited a spark of hope. My mom and I began to see a pattern, a systemic issue rather than an isolated incident. This wasn't just about my grade. It was about Mrs. Johnson abusing her power, using her position to manipulate outcomes for her own family's benefit. It was Chloe, my ever-resourceful best friend, who provided the crucial piece of the puzzle. Over milkshakes one afternoon, after I had recounted yet another failed attempt to appeal my grade, she looked at me, her eyes thoughtful. "Eliza, you need proof. Actual, undeniable proof. What if you recorded her?" My eyes widened. The idea was audacious, risky, and slightly terrifying. "Is that even legal?" I whispered. Chloe, ever the Google master, quickly looked it up. One-party consent state, Eliza. As long as you're part of the conversation, it's legal. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. This was it. This was my chance. We devised a plan. I would approach Mrs. Johnson again, ostensibly to beg for reconsideration. But this time, I would have a small digital recorder, barely larger than my thumb, hidden in my pocket. I would try to provoke her, to get her to admit, or at least strongly imply, her true motivations. I spent days practicing, rehearsing my lines, trying to anticipate her responses, preparing myself for the emotional toll it would take. My mom was initially hesitant, worried about the ethics and the potential backlash if I was caught. But the fire in my eyes, the sheer determination to fight back, convinced her. "Just be careful, my love," she warned, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "And remember, you're not doing anything wrong, she is." The day I finally approached Mrs. Johnson for the recording was nerve-wracking. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. I found her in her classroom, alone after school, grading papers as usual. The small recorder was tucked deep into my pocket, its tiny red light, I hoped, silently blinking. "Mrs. Johnson," I said, trying to sound as desperate and broken as possible. I can't accept this grade. I'm begging you. Please reconsider, it's my future. It's my valedictorian scholarship." She sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Eliza, we've been over this. Your grade is final." "But why?" I pushed, my voice thick with feigned tears. "What did I do so wrong? I've always been one of your best students. Is it because of Tiffany? Is that why you're doing this?" I held my breath, my entire body rigid with anticipation. Scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Eliza. My daughter's achievements are her own, your performance is your own. The two are entirely unrelated." But her eyes were flicking towards the empty desk next to hers, Tiffany's usual spot, a subtle tell that spoke volumes. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping as if sharing a secret but with a warning edge. "Look, Eliza, sometimes in life, you just have to accept that some people are destined for certain paths and others aren't. Tiffany has worked incredibly hard, and she deserves every bit of recognition she gets. It would be a shame for anything to complicate her success, wouldn't it?" My heart leaped. It wasn't a direct admission, but it was enough. It was the confirmation, the insidious hint, the veiled threat. She was implying that my pursuit of justice would complicate Tiffany's success, strongly suggesting that her actions were indeed driven by a desire to ensure her daughter's valedictorian title. "So, there's nothing I can do?" I asked, my voice still trembling, but now with real anger, not just feigned despair. "Absolutely nothing," she said, leaning back, a cold, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Some things are simply out of your control, Eliza. It's time you learned that." I mumbled a thank you and walked out, my hand clutching the small device in my pocket, the metallic taste of vindication on my tongue. The investigation, the discovery, had yielded its crucial piece. Now it was time for the confrontation. The weeks leading up to the school board meeting were a whirlwind of meticulous preparation and emotional fortitude. The recording, though not a direct confession, was a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence, especially when coupled with my meticulously documented grade history and the stories my mother had quietly gathered from other parents about Mrs. Johnson's preferential treatment and subtle undermining of non-favored students. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear of facing Mrs. Johnson and the entire establishment, of being disbelieved, of having my credibility questioned. But exhilaration at the prospect of finally exposing the truth, of fighting for not just myself, but for every student who had ever felt unfairly treated by someone in power. My mother was my rock. She helped me organize all the evidence, creating a binder filled with my excellent grades from other classes, my consistently high scores in Mrs. Johnson's class until the sudden drop, copies of my detailed exam answers, and the transcribed snippets from other parents' experiences. We even consulted with a family friend, a retired lawyer named Mr. Davies, no relation to the principal, who advised us on how to present our case clearly and concisely. He warned me that school boards often sided with teachers, especially long-standing, respected ones, but he emphasized the power of a compelling narrative and irrefutable evidence. I spent hours in front of my mirror, rehearsing my speech, imagining myself standing before the board, my voice steady, my arguments clear. My internal monologue was a constant battle between doubt and determination. What if they don't believe me? What if she denies everything? What if this backfires and I end up looking like a disgruntled student trying to discredit a teacher? But then I'd remember Mrs. Johnson's cold eyes, her dismissive words, the casual cruelty with which she'd shattered my dreams, and the resolve would harden. This isn't just about me, Eliza. This is about justice. This is about ensuring no other student has to go through this. This is for all of us. I envisioned my goal, not just to get my grade changed, but to expose Mrs. Johnson's abuse of power and ensure she faced real consequences. I wanted vindication, not just for my valedictorian title, but for my self-worth. I also hoped for an acknowledgement from the school, a recognition that they had failed in their oversight. My allies were my mother, Chloe, who silently supported me, ready to testify if needed, and the quiet solidarity of the few parents my mom had spoken to. They were my silent army. The school board meeting was held in the large, austere meeting room usually reserved for important administrative functions. It was a Monday evening, and the room was filled to near capacity. Board members sat behind a long, polished oak table, their faces a mixture of solemnity and mild impatience. Mr. Davies, the principal, sat at the end of the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable. And then there was Mrs. Johnson, sitting composed and prim, a picture of injured innocence, flanked by Tiffany, who looked equally demure, her eyes downcast. My mother sat beside me, her hand a warm, reassuring presence on my knee. The meeting began with a series of routine announcements, a torturous prelude to the main event. Then, the board chair, a severe-looking woman named Ms. Albright, cleared her throat. "We are here tonight to address a complaint filed by Ms. Sarah Hayes on behalf of her daughter, Eliza Hayes, regarding a disputed grade in Mrs. Alina Johnson's advanced calculus class." She then invited Mrs. Johnson to present her side. Mrs. Johnson stood, her voice clear and confident, echoing through the room. "Thank you, Ms. Albright. I stand by my professional assessment of Eliza Hayes's performance on her final calculus exam. The grade reflects a clear lack of understanding of advanced concepts. My grading standards are rigorous, consistent, and applied fairly to all students. I find these accusations baseless and deeply offensive to my integrity as an educator of over 30 years. She spoke eloquently, painting herself as a victim of a disgruntled student, her reputation under attack. She finished, receiving nods from some board members, and sat down, a faint, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. Tiffany offered her a small, sympathetic squeeze of the hand. Then Ms. Albright turned to me. "Eliza Hayes, you may present your case." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My palms were sweaty, and my voice felt like it was stuck in my throat. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely wobbly. I took a deep breath, looking directly at Mrs. Johnson, then at the board members. I clutched my carefully prepared notes, but I knew I didn't need them. The words were etched into my soul. "Thank you, Ms. Albright, members of the board," I began, my voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength with each word. "Mrs. Johnson is right about one thing." I paused, letting the statement hang in the air, and then looked directly into Mrs. Johnson's cold, triumphant eyes. "She's right when she says, some students just aren't cut out for success." I took another breath, feeling the anger, the injustice, rise within me, stealing my resolve. But she left out a crucial part of that sentence. Some students just aren't cut out for success. When they have teachers who actively undermine them, who sabotage their grades, and who abuse their power to clear the path for their own children. A ripple went through the room. Mrs. Johnson's composed expression flickered, her eyes widening slightly. Tiffany gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The principal, Mr. Davies, visibly flinched. "I have dedicated my entire academic career to excellence," I continued, my voice now strong and unwavering, "and I've always held myself to the highest standards. To be told I suddenly lack innate aptitude or conceptual understanding is not only untrue, It's a calculated fabrication designed to strip me of what I've rightfully earned. I then detailed the consistent decline in my grades in Mrs. Johnson's class in the final semester, contrasting it with my continued stellar performance in all other subjects. I presented the detailed comparison of my final exam answers with the correct solutions, highlighting the impossibility of a 58% grade. But words and numbers can be debated, I said, my gaze sweeping across the board members. Intent, however, is harder to hide, and I have something that sheds light on Mrs. Johnson's true intent. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small digital recorder. I recorded a conversation with Mrs. Johnson just last week, in which I attempted, one last time, to understand why my future was being deliberately derailed. I looked at Mrs. Johnson, whose face had gone pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I will now play that recording for the board," I announced, my finger poised over the play button. A tense silence descended, so profound you could hear a pin drop. Mrs. Johnson started to open her mouth, perhaps to object, but Ms. Albright quickly interjected, "Proceed, Ms. Hayes." I pressed play. The crackle of the recording device filled the room, followed by my own voice, slightly smaller than I remembered it, pleading, Is it because of Tiffany? Is that why you're doing this?" And then Mrs. Johnson's voice, clear and chillingly distinct, even with the background hum of the classroom. "Look, Eliza, sometimes in life, you just have to accept that some people are destined for certain paths and others aren't. Tiffany has worked incredibly hard, and she deserves every bit of recognition she gets. It would be a shame for anything to complicate her success, wouldn't it?" And then my follow-up question, "So there's nothing I can do?" And her cold, definitive answer, "Absolutely nothing. Some things are simply out of your control, Eliza. It's time you learned that." The recording ended, and the silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of Mrs. Johnson's casual malice. Mrs. Johnson herself was visibly shaking, her face a mask of shock and anger. Tiffany had tears streaming down her face, a look of profound embarrassment and mortification. Mr. Davies, the principal, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "This," I stated, my voice ringing with authority, "is not the statement of an educator grading purely on merit. This is the statement of someone actively manipulating outcomes to benefit her own child. This is an abuse of power, a betrayal of trust, and a grave injustice." I then presented the anecdotal evidence from other parents, not as formal complaints, but as a pattern of behavior, a narrative of repeated favoritism and deliberate disadvantage. I spoke of the STEM camp scholarship, the robotics club, the subtle but consistent undermining. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. The board members, who had initially been skeptical, were now leaning forward, their expressions grim. Ms. Albright, her voice sharp, turned to Mrs. Johnson. "Mrs. Johnson, do you have any explanation for the contents of this recording, or for the blatant discrepancy in Ms. Hayes's final grade?" Mrs. Johnson stammered, I was merely trying to counsel Eliza, to prepare her for the realities of the competitive world. My words were taken out of context. The grade is still based on academic merit." Her voice was shrill, desperate, a far cry from her earlier composed certainty. "Out of context," I retorted, my confidence soaring. "There is no context in which it would be a shame for anything to complicate her success. From a teacher to a student in a valedictorian race is acceptable. There is no context in which failing a student who demonstrably answered questions correctly is acceptable. You wanted Tiffany to be valedictorian, Mrs. Johnson, and you were willing to sacrifice my future to make it happen." The board went into a short, heated deliberation. I saw various board members exchanging furious whispers, casting accusatory glances at Mrs. Johnson and Principal Davies. The power dynamic had undeniably shifted. Mrs. Johnson, once the picture of authority, was now a cornered, exposed figure. Her lies had been laid bare, her carefully constructed facade shattered by her own words. My internal celebration was quiet but profound, a feeling of absolute vindication washing over me. The board's decision came swiftly, delivered by Ms. Albright with a stern, unwavering voice. After reviewing the compelling evidence presented, including the audio recording, and taking into account Mrs. Johnson's inability to provide a satisfactory explanation for the grade discrepancy, the Willow Creek School Board has reached a decision. Mrs. Alina Johnson is hereby placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation into her professional conduct, with a recommendation for termination. Furthermore, Principal Davies, for his inadequate oversight in this matter, will receive a formal reprimand and be required to undergo retraining in handling student complaints. A gasp went through the room. Mrs. Johnson slumped in her chair, her face ashen, tears finally welling in her eyes, not of remorse, but of pure, unadulterated fury and humiliation. Tiffany, next to her, buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Regarding Eliza Hayes's final calculus grade, Ms. Albright continued, looking directly at me, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. The board has ordered an immediate, independent review of her final exam. Based on the preliminary evidence presented, we anticipate her grade will be adjusted to reflect an accurate assessment of her performance. She paused, then added, and should that adjustment result in her qualifying for valedictorian, that title will be immediately reinstated. A wave of relief, so potent it made my knees weak, washed over me. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were shining with tears of pride and relief. We had won. The immediate fallout was swift and brutal for Mrs. Johnson. She was escorted out of the meeting, her once unshakable dignity utterly shattered. News of the scandal spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Mrs. Johnson, the respected educator, was now a pariah, her career in tatters, her reputation irrevocably stained. Her attempts to salvage the situation, to deny, to deflect, were useless against the undeniable truth of her own recorded words. Tiffany's valedictorian status was, indeed, revoked a week later, after my calculus grade was officially corrected to a 98%, bringing my GPA back to its near-perfect standing and securing my position at the top of the class. Tiffany, once the golden child, became the subject of whispers and uncomfortable stares. I heard through the grapevine that her parents were planning to transfer her to a private school in a neighboring town for her final weeks of senior year, eager to escape the public humiliation. The school community reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and a surprising outpouring of support for me. Other students, emboldened by my courage, began to share their own stories of Mrs. Johnson's unfairness, of subtle biases, of opportunities denied. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern that had festered for years under the guise of rigorous standards. My firm establishment of boundaries was immediate. I insisted on transparency in grading, on clear rubrics, and on an independent appeal process for all students. My vindication was not just personal. It became a catalyst for change within the school system itself. Over the next few months, the consequences for Mrs. Johnson continued to unfold. The school board's investigation uncovered multiple instances of questionable grading practices and favoritism. Her teaching license was eventually suspended, and she faced a formal inquiry by the state education board. There were even rumors of a class action lawsuit from other parents whose children's academic careers had been impacted by her actions. She essentially disappeared from public life in Willow Creek, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Tiffany, unfortunately, bore the brunt of her mother's actions. While I felt no malice towards her personally, the consequences were undeniable. She not only lost the valedictorian title, but faced social ostracism and the crushing weight of public shame. She did transfer schools and finished her senior year quietly elsewhere. I never saw her again. For me, the victory extended far beyond the school board meeting. The entire incident, traumatic as it was, solidified the bond with my mother, strengthening it into an unbreakable alliance. We had fought this battle together, and we had won. Other family members, initially hesitant to get involved, offered belated apologies and immense pride. My aunt, a former teacher, told me, "You didn't just fight for yourself, Eliza. You fought for the integrity of education." This entire ordeal created a ripple effect, awakening a sense of civic duty and justice within the community. Parents started attending school board meetings more regularly, demanding greater transparency and accountability from the administration. It was as if my courage had given others permission to finally speak up. The unexpected positive outcome for me was not just the reinstatement of my valedictorian title. but the profound realization of my own strength, my own voice, and my unwavering belief in the power of truth. Life after that victory felt like stepping into a brighter, clearer world. Graduation day was an emotional whirlwind. I stood at the podium, the valedictorian medal heavy and cool against my neck, looking out at the sea of faces, my proud mother, a beaming Chloe, even Principal Davies, who, after his reprimand, seemed genuinely reformed and offered a sincere apology before the ceremony. My speech wasn't just about academic achievements. It was about integrity, about finding your voice, about fighting for what's right, even when the odds feel insurmountable. I saw Mrs. Chen and other parents in the audience, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. It was a moment of profound triumph, not just for me, but for the principle of fairness. I went on to attend my dream university, majoring in political science with a minor in education. The scholarship, which had been in jeopardy, was secured, opening doors I once feared were permanently shut. College life was everything I had hoped for and more. I found a new sense of freedom, a confidence born from having faced down a powerful adversary and emerged victorious. I still studied diligently, but the obsessive, almost desperate drive had been replaced by a genuine love of learning, a desire to understand the world and contribute meaningfully. My career aspirations shifted from simply achieving success to actively working towards justice. I began interning at a legal aid clinic during my summers, drawn to the stories of people fighting against systemic unfairness, just as I had. I saw myself eventually working in education policy, advocating for students, and ensuring accountability within school systems. My living situation in college was a far cry from my modest home in Willow Creek, but I cherished the independence of my small dorm room, then later, a shared apartment with incredible roommates. I embraced new relationships, forming deep, intellectual friendships with people who challenged and inspired me. My mental health, once a tightrope walk of anxiety and self-doubt, blossomed into a steady state of quiet confidence and inner peace. I no longer questioned my worth based on external validation. The experience had taught me that my value was inherent, not something to be earned through endless achievement or at the mercy of someone else's arbitrary judgment. I started a small, online advocacy group for students who felt their grades or opportunities had been unfairly compromised. We built a network, shared resources, and offered support. It was fulfilling work, a direct result of my own journey, allowing me to transform a deeply painful experience into something positive and impactful. I heard stories from students across the country, each one echoing the subtle and not so subtle injustices I had faced. I reveled in my newfound freedom, the ability to make choices based on my own desires and values, rather than feeling constantly pressured to prove myself. I enjoyed simple pleasures, long walks in the park, impromptu movie nights with friends, exploring new cafes, things I had rarely allowed myself during my intense high school years. My confidence wasn't just in my academic abilities. It was in my ability to navigate the complexities of life, to stand my ground, and to speak my truth. I learned to set and maintain healthy boundaries, something I had struggled with before, always bending over backwards to accommodate others. Now, I understood that protecting my peace and my integrity was paramount. Reflecting on my personal growth, it's like looking at two different versions of myself. The Eliza before Mrs. Johnson's betrayal was driven by external validation, constantly striving, constantly proving. The Eliza after was fueled by an inner compass, a deep-seated belief in justice and self-worth. If I could go back and tell my past self one thing, it would be this: trust your gut, Eliza. If something feels wrong, it probably is, and you have the power to fight for yourself. Your voice matters more than you know. I learned that true strength isn't about avoiding conflict, but about facing it head-on, with integrity and courage. Family dynamics, I realized, can be incredibly complex, and sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those in positions of trust. But I also learned that you can forge your own family of choice, a supportive network that truly sees and values you. Forgiveness, for Mrs. Johnson, wasn't something I ever felt. What she did was too calculated, too cruel. But I learned to let go of the anger, to transform it into fuel for my advocacy, rather than letting it consume me. Healing came not from her apology, which never came, but from my own empowerment, my own journey of reclaiming my narrative. Moving forward meant building a life aligned with my values, free from the shadows of past injustices. My story, played out in the small town of Willow Creek, had a ripple effect far beyond its borders. I received emails and messages from strangers, from students and parents across the country, sharing their own experiences of unfair teachers or manipulative systems. My online advocacy group grew, becoming a small but mighty force for change. I found immense satisfaction in knowing that my experience, painful as it was, could empower others. I've had students reach out, telling me that hearing my story gave them the courage to challenge a questionable grade or report an unfair teacher. Colleagues in college were often inspired by my drive and commitment to social justice, often asking about my journey. It was a profound lesson in the power of one individual's courage to ignite a movement. So to all of you out there listening, remember this. Your voice is your most powerful tool. Don't let anyone, no matter how authoritative, diminish your worth or invalidate your truth. If you feel an injustice, speak up. If you are being undermined, fight back. It might be terrifying, it might feel impossible, but the vindication, the self-respect, the profound sense of having stood up for yourself and for what is right is worth every single ounce of courage it demands. Like, subscribe, and share your own stories in the comments below. Let's create a community where every voice is heard and every struggle becomes a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Thank you for listening.